For you, it's maybe obvious to discuss energy in Africa. Just to take a broader perspective, why Africa for the IEA? Of course, historically, we have been analyzing energy trends in the continent. We've been collecting data for decades on the continent, but the IEA has really ramped up its work on Africa, mainly because the weight of Africa in the global energy dynamics have increased. And the IEA is really tightening more its links to Africa and increasing activities through three main areas. First, institutional engagement. Today, the IEA is already working with the Africa Union Commission, Morocco and South Africa as part of the IEA family. We recently signed an MOU with Senegal, and we will continue to work with more countries engaging at the government level. Second, we do analytical work. So this report is one piece, but we'll also document region per region more topics like the best practices when it comes to clean energy transition. So this year we'll have a regional event in North Africa, and in the coming years it will be Horn and Sahel. And third, we are increasingly working on capacity reinforcement, both for statistics and long-term planning, energy modeling. And here I just want to say that we'll go to 10 sub-Saharan African countries where I'm sure that the UK or DFID already have some activities. So we are more than happy to coordinate to make sure that our new activities are well synergetic and additional to whatever technical assistance already exists. And beyond that, our Africa team is growing with more activities and more than open to discuss more with you and the different representatives of each country, other opportunities to work more together. Let me enter into the conclusion of our Africa Energy Outlook report. There are three main factors that will shape Africa's energy future. Energy, a very rapid rising population, the largest urbanization in history, and industrialization. So with these, Africa is set to be increasingly influential for global energy trends, emerging as a prominent consumer and supplier of energy. Africa's energy future really has the potential to be bright with modern energy sources such as renewable and natural gas that already act as an accelerator to development in many countries. But in many other countries, there is a large disconnect between the potential and today's energy reality related to access to electricity and clean cooking deficits, related to the very low investment in power sector, and also the heavy weight of traditional use of biomass in the energy mix. But many things are changing in Africa. We have falling price of renewable technologies, evolving opportunities due to resource endowment, and we also have great success stories. So this is why the IEA took a new look at Africa 5 years after the latest Africa Energy Outlook, and looking especially at 11 countries. So we'll have specific country profiles that might be of interest for those of you who are based in those countries. The IEA is working on projections and scenario. We often do a business as usual scenario, which looks at the existing trends, policy in place, investment, available technologies. And we also define another scenario, which in this case is called the Africa case, where we took it reversely, saying if we want Africa to get the industrial and economic development as envisaged in the Agenda 2063, as well as reaching the SDG 7 target and limiting pollution, what the pathway shall be. So this is our Africa case scenario. So let me start with demographics. Today, China and India are the most populous regions of the world, but Africa has the fastest growing and the youngest population, actually. Today in Africa, the median age is 20 years, which is 10 years younger than the global average. And if we look at the trends, by 2023, Africa will be the most populous region. And looking even ahead, by 2040, we are looking at a continent of more than 2 billion people. So this means that 1 in 2 people that are added to the world population by 2040 are set to be African. And at that time, Africa population will still be very young and younger than the global average, with a median age of 25 years old. Looking country per country, we'll have Nigeria, Ethiopia, and DRC amongst the top 10, and also Egypt and Tanzania with more than 100 million inhabitants. And just to mention, Nigeria will have a population of close to 340 million people, so number 4 just behind the United States. But behind these trends, we also see urbanization and a growing population, a young population, and increasingly an urban population. What we anticipate is that the urban population is set to grow by more than 500 million over the coming 20 years. Just to give you an idea of comparison, the fast urbanization that we saw in China under the booming period, the first decade of the century, was half of what we expect for Africa. So Africa urbanization will be twice as big as what China experienced, and which led to so much increase in energy demand. The energy sources that are used to meet energy demand growth in Africa will not be the same as the past. Today, when we look at the energy mix, the green part of the chart is biomass. An important, well, nearly half of energy demand in Africa today is met by biomass under traditional use at household level for daily cooking, for example. And if we were to look at sub-Saharan Africa, this part will be even bigger. Because here we are looking at the scope is Africa as a continent. We have coal, which is quite restricted to South Africa and a few other countries. Natural gas today is mostly restricted to North Africa. So again, in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, biomass is really the main source of energy. So looking ahead in our stated policies scenario, so under current trends, announced policies, we see that the GDP in Africa could increase by 2.5, while the energy demand will increase by 1.6. And here we see an increase of almost all the fuels. When we look at oil, you see a significant increase, and actually it's a 3.1 million barrel per day increase between today and 2040, which means that Africa will be the second region for the growth of oil demand before China, and just second to India. And this increase in oil demand will come from transport, car passengers. If we look at today, the ownership level of cars in Africa is very low. We only have 15 cars per 1,000 people, which is 10 times lower than the global average. So according to our analysis, this number is set to grow to 22 cars per 1,000 people in 2040. And this will mean more cars, more trucks on the roads, so an increased consumption of oil. But there will be also more oil products, and namely LPG for cooking. This is some of the reasons for the important increase in the oil demand. We also see an important increase in gas in the country, but the bulk of the increase is on renewable. But then the interesting point is that when we look at our Africa case scenario, we see that Africa could fuel a GDP and an economy 4 times bigger, only with 50% more energy. And the main difference between the two scenarios presented comes from energy efficiency. So looking at our Africa case, there is an opportunity for a stronger and bigger economy with lower energy consumption. And this relies on reduction of the biomass consumption by moving away from traditional use of biomass to more modern energy for cooking. And this also comes from an even bigger share of renewables in the energy mix. Looking at the energy access challenge, it has 2 components, electricity and clean cooking. And the IEA has been tracking year after year data from each country on number of people having access to energy. On the electricity side, we saw a peak in 2013 for sub-Saharan Africa, and today it's a bit less than 600 million people which are still without access to electricity. Under current trends, this is set to remain at a bit more than 540 by 2030, which is the date when the international community has defined the goal of universal access under SDG 7. So we see some countries with success stories and that will make it and that will reach full electrification rate before 2030. Kenya made huge progress over the last years. The electrification rate at a national level was 25% in 2013. It increased to 75% today. Ethiopia as well made strong progress. Ghana, Senegal, and Rwanda, just to mention them. But the majority of sub-Saharan African countries are not reaching full access by 2030. And the momentum behind current policies and trends is not enough to reach full access. Looking at clean cooking, the situation is worse, with today close to 1 billion people still relying on traditional use of biomass or polluting fuels for energy access. And this is just set to remain under the 1 billion limit, but not to decrease significantly before 2030. Again, we have some countries that manage to limit the growth or the number of those without access to clean cooking, but for the majority of them, the progress which are made are outpaced by population growth. So our analysis show that another future is possible and that we can reach full access by 2030, but this will be achievable by integrated strategies, meaning that in terms of technologies and solutions to provide full access, we'll need to combine grid extension, densification, and mini-grid and standalone system. And these analyses are based on geospatial analysis that we conducted, looking at where the grid is, where population are, and what's the least cost pathway to provide electricity service to everyone. And the same goes for clean cooking. We need a combination of technologies and solution if we want to reach a universal access by 2030. LPG and electricity would be the most convenient of the cheapest solution, mostly in urban settlements. Improved cook stoves and gas and biogas and other could be well fitted for urban areas. So moving to another topic, we conducted an analysis on cooling needs for Africa. As of today, you can see that you have 700 million people that need cooling. That means that they live in places where the daily temperature, 24 hours, never goes below 25 degrees. And some of them live in mega cities. Due to the impact of climate change, we foresee that 20 years from now, it will be 1.2 billion people that will live in such regions, and many of them living in mega cities where the problem is even bigger. So today, the rate of ownership of cooling device is very, very low, but we foresee that with the emergence of middle class and more consumption in Africa, there might be a very important increase in the demand for electricity related to residential cooking. Energy efficiency is a solution to reduce this demand, and here we are looking at standards that policymakers can implement to make sure that the appliances, the devices that are imported, may that be AC or fans, that there are some standards to make sure that those appliances are efficient. And we are not looking at the latest lab technologies in the world, but more at average appliances that already exist in the world and that are available and affordable in other regions. So efficiency is a really important key to all our projections for this Africa case scenario. And just to insist here in the fact that cooling is not only about comfort and having AC in an office, it's cooling for the cold chain of agricultural and food. It's cooling for health and preservation of vacuums. So it's really beyond the residential and the comfort part.
Firstly, I'll start with electricity and the role of renewables. In Africa, as elsewhere, electricity is increasingly becoming the fuel of choice for households and companies. And this in turn has important implications for the energy sector. African electricity demand rose by an average of 3% per year over the last decade to reach about 700 terawatt hours last year. This 700 terawatt hours, though, presents a rather distorted picture in that South Africa and the North African economies accounted for about 3/4 of this demand, with the residual quarter allocated across sub-Saharan Africa, where electricity demand or electricity use in terms of kilowatt hours per household is amongst the lowest in the world. And this contrasts very much with what we're going to see in the future, where sub-Saharan Africa will account for the bulk of the growth in electricity demand over the lifetime to 2040. If we take a look at our Africa case, which sees higher energy demand as a result of higher economic activity, this creates a virtuous cycle in that the development of local industries and services drives electricity demand growth. And this in turn increases employment and incomes, which in turn increases the consumption patterns of households. More goods are bought, more services are bought, more appliances are bought, etc. So in this case, the electricity demand more than triples to over 2,300 terawatt hours by 2040. Now, where is this growth in demand being driven by? Firstly, Arnaud talked a little about the increased electricity access. And in the Africa case, all households have access by 2030. But by 2040, this only contributes to about 330 terawatts of demand. But growth in demand from the emerging middle class and the higher income households makes a larger contribution, or about 1/3 of the total, which goes hand in hand with the growth in demand from productive uses. And together, well-off households and productive uses account for about 80% of electricity use. And the productive uses are largely services and light industry, which account for 90% of the productive use, with the remaining 10% in agriculture. Now, where does that electricity come from? If we look at electricity supply in Africa today, it's largely balanced between hydropower and natural gas. Solar PV and other forms of renewable energy have had very little impact to date. There's about 5 gigawatts of solar PV in Africa at the moment, the equivalent of the Netherlands. Gas is reserved for the traditional producers such as Nigeria, but also countries such as Senegal, Mozambique, and Tanzania. So if we take a look at the demand in the future, gas accounts for a major share of the growth, driven by not just North Africa, but not just Nigeria, but new discoveries in Tanzania, in Mozambique, in Senegal, in South Africa. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Renewables are the big story, making up about 3/4 of the additional needs across the continent and contributing about half of electricity supply in 2040. This happens as a result of the huge resources that are already on the continent and the falling technology costs. And what we see is double-digit growth in deployment of solar PV across the continent, as well as other technologies. In the Africa case, solar PV deployment reaches about 15 gigawatts a year, going as high as 320 gigawatts in total by 2040, and overtaking hydropower and natural gas being the largest source of electricity in terms of capacity, and also the second largest in terms of generation. And it reaches the size of the US solar PV market, which is one of the biggest in the world at the moment. And alongside the large-scale projects, which are already emerging in Africa, distributed solar PV will play a very, very important role in delivering affordable access to households across the continent. Hydropower will still remain a cornerstone of the power system, and better regional cooperation, greater integration of power networks can unlock hydro's huge potential, and large projects that wouldn't be justified on domestic power demands, such as those foreseen in DR Congo, in Ethiopia, and Mozambique, allow these countries to become exporters to neighboring countries and to regions. Wind also expands rapidly in several countries where there are quality resources, mainly in East Africa and to a lesser extent in Senegal, but also in South Africa, while Kenya is at the forefront of geothermal deployment. Now, building a reliable power system is a lot more than tapping domestic resources. It also means a bigger focus on transmission and distribution assets. In other words, targeted investment and maintenance to reduce losses and outages. And losses today in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, around 16%. And even if we could reduce it to a level somewhere near advanced economies, or something around less than 10%, would make a substantial increase in the efficiency of the economy and the power sector. We also need to build up the technical and regulatory capacity in order to develop the power pools and strengthen regional electricity markets. Now, I mentioned investment there very, very briefly, and investment is one of the major challenges in Africa at the moment. If it's to expand its energy infrastructure, especially in the power sector, radical changes are going to be needed to the investment framework. To put things in context, Africa is home to about 17% of the world's population, but it accounts for roughly 4% of global power investment. On a per capita basis, power supply investment in Africa is amongst the lowest in the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, power generation capacity has shown little or no growth since 1990, while that in India and Southeast Asia has multiplied fourfold. Now, addressing this deficit will require a huge ramp up in spending. Investments in power supply need to double between now and 2040 in the stated policy scenario, and to double again if we are to realize the economic reality of the Africa case. This investment is needed for a number of purposes. Half of it is to expand and upgrade electricity networks, including mini-grids, and most of the rest is needed to invest in low-carbon generation capacity, where solar PV plays a very, very important role. Now, if we compare the investment needs with GDP, the cumulative investment need in Africa's power sector between today and 2040 is the equivalent of about 2.6% of the continent's GDP. If we look at the investments that's needed in the Africa case between now and 2040, we need to invest about 1.6% of the continent's GDP in the stated policy scenario and about 2.4% in the Africa case. And mobilizing this level of investment is a huge undertaking and will require a huge effort, not just from African governments, but also from the global financial and development community. And then we do a comparison with India, China, and Southeast Asia. And this indicates that this level of mobilization is possible with changes. And Africa can look to these countries for examples of what works and what doesn't work. And I think India, with some of the initiatives they've had over the last 20 years to mobilize investment in the power sector, is a very, very interesting example. But if we are to realize the scale of investment that's required in Africa, I would point to three things. The first is, and I alluded to this earlier, we've got to improve the financial and operational efficiency of the utilities. It's not just about losses and outages, but it's also about the ability of the utilities to recover the cash to meet their day-to-day expenses. When you take this poor collection rates with below-cost tariffs, the investment risks are higher, and it makes it very, very difficult for African utilities to secure financing at an affordable cost. Secondly, we have to facilitate the more effective use of public funds to catalyse private capital flows. In sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, every dollar of public funding, for example, development finance institutions, state budgets, or export credit agencies, attracts about 60 cents of private capital, indirectly or directly. This compares very unfavorably with other markets. For example, in Southeast Asia, it's almost $1, and in South Africa, it's $4. It's very, very important for international investment institutions to scale up direct investment, but also to take private sector investment with them through targeted interventions. And finally, there's a strong need to nurture Africa's own financial sector to ensure a sustained flow of long-term financing to energy projects. And a good example of somewhere where this has achieved progress is in Kenya, where reforms in the financial sector have resulted in substantial flows of private capital into the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, which in turn has increased its capacity to bring electricity to its population. I also spoke very briefly earlier on about natural gas. Natural gas is facing a potential turning point in Africa. Today, the continent accounts for about 4% of global gas demand and about 6% of production. In North Africa, it's an established fuel and meets about half of the region's energy needs today. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it's very much a niche fuel, and the share of gas in the energy mix is probably the lowest in the world. But there are numerous reasons and causes for optimism, and it's possible that the future for natural gas in Africa may be very, very different than in the past. In recent years, there's been a number of major discoveries in Africa, all across the continent, in Egypt, in the Zohr field and other adjacent fields, in East Africa, in Mozambique and Tanzania, in West Africa, in Senegal and Mauritania, and also in South Africa. And between 2011 and 2018, the African continent accounted for about 40% of global gas discoveries. And when you take this alongside new LNG technology innovations, these developments could fit very, very well with Africa's push for industrial growth and also the need for a reliable electricity sector. In gas, Africa will become a major player, not just a producer, but also a consumer and an exporter. It will export similar amounts to Australia, and gas demand will be similar to Japan and Korea combined. Minerals, there's a critical link between African minerals and the global energy transition. Key minerals such as manganese, cobalt, platinum, titanium, which are all vital for batteries, for storage technologies, for wind farms, for solar PV technologies, are abundant in Africa. DRC accounts for vast amounts of the world's cobalt resources. Vast amounts of the world's platinum resources are found in South Africa. And the share of these mineral resources in exports in a large number of African countries is vast. They account for a large share of GDP and potential GDP growth in the future. Therefore, it's very, very important that any questions around these resources and that the countries can keep up with rising demand are addressed. The practices at present are often inefficient, polluting, and politically problematic. So failure to address these problems and keep up with demand could hold back their economies, but also hold back energy transitions elsewhere. The sector needs robust regulatory oversight mechanisms to ensure that the impact of developments on environments are limited and that revenues are used in a very transparent manner. And there's also a very careful need to manage the sourcing of these minerals as well as the supply chains. Finally, climate change. If we look back historically over the age of industrialization since 1890, Africa is responsible for a very, very, very small share of global greenhouse gas emissions, somewhere around 2% over the period today. Even if we look at the economic growth we see in the stated policy scenario, this share grows to about 3% of global emissions between now and 2040. If we look at the Africa case, in which the economy grows much faster, the share of emissions rises by a similar level, because even though we've increased economic and industrial activity, the shift away from bioenergy reduces the share of greenhouse gas emissions and offsets the increase from industrial activity. So the important point to make is the increased industrialization potential in Africa will not result in any increase in global or in greenhouse gas emissions from the continent. Conversely, Africa is the continent most at risk from the effects of changing climate, not just the needs for cooling, but also the impact it will have on investments in the power sector, particularly on hydropower developments, where river flows will be interrupted, power flows may stop as a result. So the emphasis here should be on resilience in new energy infrastructure.